I'd like to welcome our folks over here to talk about candidates and good ideas and how they go together. Come on up.
We have no good ideas.
As I said in the beginning, if you want to run as a Republican for the legislature in this state, Bryan Eppstein is the man that you want to hire. If you're a Democrat and you want to run for the legislature in this state, Fero is the man you want to run. Come on up and let's talk.
You go ahead.
All right, thanks.
You came to the longest. Brian's on the left.
Yeah, mix it up.
What I'd like to do is I'd like to ask a couple of questions right now, to take a short break, and then I'll ask some more questions, but I hope you guys can ask some questions as well. So let me start this off, with a softball. Okay, what do you guys think makes a good candidate? And what are you looking for, as people that help to recruit candidates, that help run campaigns in terms of what a good candidate is? Since Bryan, you came the longest, why don't you start?
Well, I don't think there's any magic formula that makes a winning candidate. I think a lot of it depends on the objectivity of the race. If a race is winnable and you have somebody that has the right personality, the right background, the right funding, then just any combination of circumstance can make for a good candidate. Some of the worst candidates I've worked for are anesthesiologists, brain surgeons, and trial lawyers, because these professions seem to think that they know everything, and they don't take advice very well. And that's one thing I look for in a good candidate, somebody that will take advice. Because somebody who tries to be their own political consultant, and political consulting is in the X chromosome, so we all have it. But if you try to be your own doctor or your own political consultant, you're probably going to fail. So one of the things when a person runs for office is they really need to have a good advisor. Someone who can objectively tell them whether their jokes are funny, whether their speech is on point, whether their body language is appealing or not, and whether they have messed up, and if they have messed up, how to respond, or if they're under attack, how best to respond to attack. There's a phrase that I don't know if you have it in your office, but we have it in our office, and that's bleeders. We love to challenge incumbents that are bleeders, that every time you prick them with something negative, they come back and respond. They bleed all over the place. And when you're a challenger, and you can get your opponent to acknowledge you, you're generally going to catch up with them. So that's one of the qualities we also look for in a candidate is to how thick their skin is. Are they thick-skinned? Can they keep their focus? Kind of like a racehorse running down the track. They have blinders on their eyes, so they don't look at the horses on either side of them. They just look towards the finish line. We try, as political consultants, we try to put blinders on the candidates so they stay focused on the objective of winning, and they don't get off on all these rabbit trails of correcting inaccuracies or responding to a negative comment. But a winning candidate is somebody that is very, very disciplined. Whether they're disciplined in a press interview, where they keep coming back to the message or the point over and over, or whether they're disciplined enough that when they walk into a room, they know which hands they're going to shake, they know what points they're going to make, and they know they have to be somewhere in 15 minutes, so they need to be in and out in a hurry.
Yep. Bryan said it all. The two things in my rephrasing of it, the two things a candidate does, the two jobs a candidate has in a campaign is to raise money and to campaign, to go to the events, to make the telephone calls to the political brokers, and to be a full-time candidate, and not to get off on all the other distractions that Bryan just described, of responding to this or worrying about that. That's why a good campaign team around a candidate can then take care of all those other things, as long as a candidate is willing to take on a new job of being a candidate, doing two things, raising money and talking to people. This, if I may, on the Donna Howard thing,
sure.
Just sort of spritz off of that a little bit. The context of that race, as Paul said, was not only a Republican district, an incumbent Republican state rep, a race in 2004 in which the Democrat ran the world's worst campaign and still came 150 votes from winning. So clear signal that the incumbent Republican was vulnerable, and a well-run campaign with a good candidate could actually win. Well, the conventional wisdom in this town and in most political towns was, no, it's a new election cycle, Democrat can't win. Republicans are even stronger than they were, and the Democratic establishment said, we're not putting a dime into that race, can't be won. There was a field of candidates after the incumbent Republican resigned, triggering a special election. Then the dynamic changed. There were 4 candidates in the race, including Donna. Donna was someone I had heard about through the years and never met. We had a mutual friend, and he kept calling me and saying, you know, I think Donna might be all right for this race. So I called my friend finally and said, set up a meeting. I want to meet this woman you've been telling me about for years. And we met in a restaurant, and she walked in, and I said, oh, well, yeah, okay, I get it. This makes sense. And I talked to her for 10 minutes and went through all the points mentally that you have said. Is she authentic? Does she want to do this? She have the fire in her belly? Does she care about issues? Is she willing to be the candidate Bryan just described? Disciplined, raise the money. That's Donna's weak point. She doesn't like to raise money. But we were able to raise something for her. And she did enough of it to get by. But I just fell in love immediately. Bryan and I've talked before, you know, consultants tend to fall in love with their candidates. Not all of them.
Definitely.
Maybe 1 or 2 that doesn't describe. But, you know, we want to fall in love with our candidates because we're going to devote an awful lot of time and energy and emotional drive to this. And that was Donna. So when you went to the bar and the people were denigrating this spot because it wasn't good enough and it wasn't going to win a poly and all of that, what it was speaking to the women we had identified were going to elect Donna. And it was on Lifetime cable TV, and all of my male friends were saying, how come you're not putting her on the air? And I said, she's been on the air for 2 weeks. She's just out on ESPN. Mm-hmm. And by the time...
I must have been watching Lifetime TV.
That's right. and what that also did was, because she was able to pull it off, as you saw in that terrible ad, the good thing about that ad is that she just pulls it off. She just talks to you. She's authentic. And she's not faking it. And it communicated. And she was in voters' living rooms for weeks at a time we didn't have much money, so it was a low-level cable TV buy. But when you watched the Food Network, you saw Donna Howard, and she was a guest in your living room. And by the time the Republican realized that he was in danger of losing and started attacking her, she had become a friend of the family. And how dare him attack this woman who'd been in your living room for weeks? So she was the perfect candidate in that sense. She was able to pull all of that off. And I don't know if she's going to get an opponent this time or not.
And sometimes, I wasn't involved in this race, but sometimes, you know, a candidate might win for circumstances beyond themselves. And probably in this particular race, this person kind of empathized better with the voters here in Travis County, and putting it into the context of the incumbent Republican who had resigned, had taken a $250 million job as a lobbyist. That's why he's so happy when you see him right now. And putting into context that the person who was Donna's opponent had run once before for state senate against Gonzalo Barrientos and gotten clobbered despite spending over $1 million, but had gotten caught into a connection with Tom DeLay right at the very pinnacle of all the criticism of Tom DeLay, I think right before he left Congress. So it's, you know, the old saying, being in the right place at the right time with the right candidate had everything to do with that particular race. And oftentimes, you know, even the Austin American-Statesman did not endorse Donna Howard. The Austin American-Statesman surprisingly endorsed the Republican candidate. But their endorsement was a really kind of backhanded endorsement, because in the endorsement, they actually brought out the relationship between Benson and Tom DeLay, which then ended up being the whole issue for the rest of the campaign, I think.
That's true. That's true. One of the reasons Bryan's successful is that he does not do what most political consultants do, and what a lot of candidates have a tendency to do, and that is to run the last race and run it on the issues that worked last time. That Donna Howard race was one where everyone expected her to make Tom DeLay the issue. Others did on her behalf, but she never did. She ran it about education. As you recall, we were going into a special session on public school finance. That was the only issue in the race. There was no other issue. And she focused on that, and others tried to focus on other issues that just simply weren't, they were the past. Every election is about the future. Sometimes the candidates in it allow you to talk about the candidate's particular past, his ties to DeLay, for example. But voters are always looking for the next step, the future change, and a positive change that has to do with the future. And that's what this race was about. The other candidates in the race ran last year's race.
It was interesting on Sunday. Again, I don't know how many people over here are as dedicated watchers of Fox News as I am on Sunday mornings. But how many people here saw Hillary Clinton in the first of her 5 talk show appearances? I think she did all 5 talk shows on Sunday. Did you see her on Fox?
I heard her on the radio.
Okay, very first question Chris Wallace asks is that she hasn't been on Fox for over 3.5 years, 4 years. The last time Clinton was on there, it was Bill Clinton going mano a mano with Chris, in terms of Fox News' coverage. And the very first question on the box is not about Iraq, it's not about the economy, it's about the relationship of the Clintons with Fox News. And what does she do? Does she scream at them? Does she get uptight? Does she yell? She laughs. Okay, and that's all they were talking about when they had their big panel, about how good she was in terms of sticking to her own deal, and not taking the bait. Okay, when you talk about candidate discipline, no matter what happens to Hillary Clinton running for the presidency, at least up to this point, she's been a very disciplined candidate. Bryan, when a candidate walks into the office, let's say Steckler comes in and goes, I want to be somebody. I want to be a state representative.
Well,
okay.
I want to hear this.
Okay, what are you going to do? What are you going to ask me, and how are you going to size me up? What's important to you?
Well, I tell you, to play off a comment you made a while ago, I think the best political candidate I have seen in the last 2 weeks on national media is not a politician. It's the commissioner of the NFL, Roger Goodell. I don't know if any of y'all saw his interview on TV with Costas. Mm-hmm. He was just hammered, because think about it, in the NFL right now, you have the Michael Vick dog fighting scandal, you have the Belichick illegal videotaping, stealing signs and signals thing, and Goodell just stayed on point in his interview. He was relaxed, he took criticism, he involved all the argument, and he was direct and answered all the questions. And I think that struck me as the perfect way you want a candidate to be. So obviously, the NFL commissioner has been getting a lot of really good media training, because the way he came across that interview is almost how you'd want a politician to come across anytime they're interviewed. But when people come to see me, they're looking to run for office. Once we've gone through the preliminary checks, is their district winnable? Do they have the money necessary to execute a winning strategy? Are they competitive among their competition? Most candidates are very deflated. And there's a guy in Fort Worth who served on the city council who's a Harvard MBA. He likes to tell this story to other people before they come to see me, that don't be upset when Bryan tells you that you are the least important thing that he's looking at when he evaluates whether a candidate can win a race or not. Because really, it's not the smartest person or the most qualified person. In fact, how many LBJ graduates have been elected to the legislature? Two. I think two. But it's
One
not
was in Colorado.
Yeah, it's not the best person, but it's generally the person that emphasizes the best. I'll give you 2 examples of when I have people come to see me. If it's someone that I have a good reason to be skeptical of, I'll have them fill out an application sitting in front of me. And I like to watch their body language and watch how they fill it out. And I had a guy come see me in 1994 who filled out the application. He got to the part that says, have you ever been arrested? And he paused on that question, and he skipped over it. And he filled out the rest of the questionnaire. So I'm going over it with them. I say, oh, I see you skipped over this. I guess that's because you've never been arrested. He goes, well, 7 months ago, he goes, I got pulled over in Dallas for illegal possession of a handgun. And this guy was from East Texas. He goes, everybody has a gun in East Texas. And I drove into the big city, and I just forgot to take my handgun under the front seat of my car and put it around in the trunk. And I'm thinking, oh, that's great, because gun ownership in East Texas is a huge deal. So I'm thinking, we'll plant this on ourselves, so late in the campaign we'll have it come up that our guy got arrested for bringing his handgun into the dangerous big city. And I'm thinking, this is awesome. And so I tell this guy, I say, okay, we'll take you as a client, but you need to have, what happened? He goes, well, I got deferred adjudication. Even better. So I said, have your defense attorney send me the file. I just need to read through it and be prepared. And so the campaign goes on. He never sends me the file. I keep asking for it, and asking for it, and asking for it. So I learned a real important lesson in 1994 that on my resume, if they answer the question, have you ever been arrested before? If they answer it yes, I need to ask the next question, which I didn't know at the time, and that is, what was the probable cause for your arrest? Because yes, this candidate had been convicted, convicted for legal possession of a handgun, or not, for having it in the wrong place. But what he failed to tell me was the probable cause for him encountering the police in the first place went something like this. And the reason I had to ask this guy this question was these two police officers from Dallas were going fishing in East Texas, and they were driving by all these political signs for my client. And it dawned on them that of the thousands of arrests they had made, they remembered arresting this guy for having 3 prostitutes in his car in the middle of a police sting operation. And so they felt it was important for them to go all over East Texas, from Beaumont to Tyler to Dallas, and let the world know that this was the guy they had arrested for soliciting prostitution. And he had been arrested, he had been pulled over for soliciting prostitution, but when the police were searching his car, they found the gun. And here, a gun possession crime is more serious than soliciting prostitution, so that's what they charged him for. So, but they were distributing this all over the district, and the problem was this information was only obtainable through a sealed document, a document that's not publicly available. And so we had attorneys call all the TV stations, all the radio stations, all the newspapers, and because at the time my client told me this story. He said, I was in Dallas at 2 in the morning. Me and my buddies had been to some bars. I dropped my buddies off. I was heading back to my hotel. I was over on Oak Lawn or somewhere. And I pulled up to this traffic light, observing the architecture in the area. It's like Bonfire of the Vanities. And I noticed this woman being beaten up by this guy on a street corner, and she breaks away. She runs over to my car. She bangs on the window. She says, let me in, I'm being attacked. So my client, being the good citizen that he was, and he was an all-American guy, CPA, #1 graduate from SFA, he lets her in the car. He drives around the corner to where it's safer and lets her out. It's just that he let her out in the middle of a police sting operation. And so that was the story. And now he stuck to it. And with his fiance calling me saying that that my candidate client had lied to her, had lied to me. I said, oh no, you got it all wrong. Here's what Drew told me. And so anyway, just on the basis of believing my client, as hard as it was to really believe him, and the fact that the attack was being used with unsubstantiated evidence, we were able to get every media outlet but one to pull the story off the air. And the one outlet that ran it was the newspaper in Nacogdoches, Texas. And their headline was, because my client's story was he had saved this one woman, but the police were contending there were 3 prostitutes in the car. So the headline in Nacogdoches paper was, oh really, Drew, were there 3 or 1 prostitutes? And long story short, we won, a Republican in a fairly Democrat area, and we won because that year we were running in East Texas, and the number one issue in East Texas was lawsuit abuse being perpetuated by these overly aggressive personal injury trial lawyers, and our opponent was a personal injury trial lawyer. So when the voters went to vote, they had to decide whether they wanted to vote for the guy who was accused of soliciting prostitution or this greedy personal injury trial lawyer. And just to reinforce the message on our signs, it didn't say conservative cut taxes or a person like it said not another lawyer. And so voters went to the polls and they voted for not another lawyer. And that was a great deal. And we ended up getting this particular candidate after he was elected off of some other minor offenses while he was in office. But it was the night that
until he moved to the big leagues.
But it was the night that he called me where he said he had just left the Texas Senate to go with his good friend Wayne Christian, who was a Republican state rep from Nacogdoches, Texas, and they had just gone, this is a real story, to the reception being hosted by the Texas Christian Coalition, and they had done their good deed attendance thing at that reception. And my client had just dropped off Representative Christian at his apartment. He was driving back to meet his new wife. They'd been married 2 months. His brand new wife. And he's going over the South Congress Bridge. He sees another woman that needs some help. and I think he was asking her if she needed a tow, and it was a tow job. Something got miscommunicated. Anyway, he got arrested again for soliciting prostitution. But this time, the lady he was soliciting was an undercover policewoman who was wired and being videotaped. Of course, my client denies it all. I get the phone call late at night that he'd been arrested again. And, we resigned. Now, there's some firms in this town that on the second time we have these unbelievable things, we have small slivers of integrity, so we walk away from those. We walked away from this. And there's another, actually he's one of the best PR spin guys in Austin in the state, Bill Miller. Bill was more than happy to take this guy on as a client, because what a challenge this would be. So he took on this guy, and this guy had Bob Bullock at the time, had all the senators testify, character witnesses, but he was convicted because he was soliciting, but he was in the middle of a 4-year term. And so he was convicted, and he's the only client I have who has concurrently served has served concurrently both in the Travis County Jail on the weekends, and during the week they would let him out to serve on the floor of the Texas State Senate. And I do have other clients who have gone to prison, but he's the only one who has served concurrently in jail and in public office. When it came time for him to run for re-election, we didn't ask him if he was going to, because he was, but we went out and recruited a whole new candidate to run, whose name was Todd Staples, who's now the Texas Commissioner of Agriculture. And but you got to be careful when candidates come to talk to you. But I'll share with you real quick, and I don't want to cut your time, but in 2002, I had 3 candidates come to see me from Waco, Texas. And they all were running for the same open state representative district. Now, these were Republicans, and there were 4 Republicans running. And all 3 of them came to see me on back-to-back-to-back days. And the first person who came to see me was a multimillionaire, a really nice person, but about 90% of his conversation was consumed with being obsessed with one of his opponents. He just kept continually referring to this one guy, attacking him. And I kept thinking, that's just a little much. And then the next day, that guy comes, and he sees me, and he's like well-qualified, very articulate. Everyone likes this guy. He's obsessed with continually talking about the first guy I talked to. Very obsessed about it. The third guy comes to see me. He's just your regular old guy, shirt's buttoned wrong, and he had run a hamburger business that had gone under, but he had gotten successful in the funeral business. I don't know what the relationship is. And I thought, hey, this is refreshing. This guy didn't say anything about his opponents. He's more of a challenge. I'll represent this guy. So I tell the other 2 guys we're not going to represent them. Long story short, this was 6 months before the filing deadline, so we get right up to within 30 days of the filing deadline, and my guy had gone from obscurity into contention to possibly win this primary. And he came into my office and he said, he goes, that thing you call opposition research? He goes, you might want to do that on me. And I said, oh, really, why? He goes, I'm just curious what you might find. I said, well, why don't you just tell me what I might find? He goes, no, I'm just kind of curious because, I've had these. So we did a background check on our client, and sure enough, there was some interesting stuff. And even though he was leading the field in fundraising, had raised over $250,000, had gotten over 600 people to endorse him, based on my professional assessment, I decided it would be best if he just quietly withdrew from the race, which he did. And so that left these other two guys, the guys that were obsessed with each other. And not that I'm good at reading people, but here's what ended up happening in that campaign. The day before the primary election, one of the guys had had an affair with a lady at a motel in Waco, and the other guy, of course, being obsessed with this guy, had had a private eye following this guy around. And the private eye had filmed it. You can just imagine driving up to the hotel and then walking in, and it was pretty good stuff. And so he filmed it. He then distributed a copy of the videotape to everybody he could think of the day before the election. And so it explodes. This issue is very explosive. These two guys go into a runoff, and this is the big scandal of Waco. And so the Republican county chairman, who was a former state rep, he says that this was a dirty deed that was done, the filming of this affair, even though the affair was in Waco, Texas, you can only imagine was a dirty deed too. But it was really a dirty deed to film that and then distribute it and expose the family and the wife and the children and all this. And so the person who had done the filming ended up winning that primary. And he's running in a district that is just ridiculously Republican. And the chairman is still saying negative things about him. So he goes over to the Republican county office in McLennan County and wants to talk to the chairman. The chairman locks the door and won't let this guy in. This guy goes apoplectic. He has an out-of-body experience. He starts lightly banging on the door, then kicking on the door, then impaling himself on the door. And the county chairman was audio recording all this. And then he puts it on the web so everyone can hear it. And anyway, this guy ends up losing in the general election, a district that is just, it's more than it's a yellow monkey Republican district. It's just so Republican, it's ridiculous. But people ended up voting for the Democrat because they didn't want to vote for this ridiculous Republican that had been so obsessed that he had done all these crazy, out-of-body experience things. So when people come to see me, I'm sure Democrats have more in the normality range, but Republicans are all shapes and sizes. And I could tell you thousands of stories, but all candidates are just a microcosm of anybody. And there's not a single person that's ever walked in my office that didn't have one thing in their background. It would probably be something you wouldn't want to be publicly aired. And that's the one thing, when people do run for public office, it is very courageous because Wayne will get the microscope out, and he'll really take a closer look at every aspect of your life. And just because you had that DWI on a fraternity prank or a sorority outing, if you think, oh, that was a long time ago, it will surface. All kinds of things surface in a political campaign. So people who do run really open themselves up for a lot of scrutiny. And generally, it's not the press that we're then faced with, like, there's 100 skeletons on this opponent, but which skeleton is going to make the difference to win the race? Because reality doesn't matter. Perception matters. I can say that Kelly has 10 DWIs, but if Kelly is also the Travis County president of Mothers Against Drunk Driving and a great citizen, you may not believe that even though it's true. But if Kelly got pulled over this morning for DWI, and I bring out that he has 10, knowing that he only has 8, and then he goes to the microphone and says, I don't have 10, I have only 8 DWIs, then it's more believable.
Kelly, what about this whole idea of being able to elect a bad candidate as opposed to the role of a campaign in terms of being able to overcome candidates' weaknesses? If you were challenged on that as somebody who runs campaigns, consultant, what would you say?
Well, of course, I've never done such a thing, but I'm looking at that bottle of water there, Texas Crystal. There's a bad candidate. I've elected a couple of times who owns that company and failed to elect in the big one.
Which candidate was this?
Attorney General Jim Maddox.
Okay.
Jim Maddox was the kind of candidate who was, as you were describing earlier, the trust factor. It just wasn't there, largely due to Wayne's fine publication and their unreasonable jihad against him. But yes, of course. I mean, I think that all you need to do is walk on the floor of the Texas House, and you can verify that bad candidates get elected every 2 years.
Yeah, definitely there are a lot of non-sharp dressers on the floor of the state House.
I was just say one thing about Maddox and Kelly. Jim Maddox, the Attorney General of Texas, had a very strong constituency. He's a populist person, and to the extent that was embraced by real strong Democrats, he had followers and he had supporters, and very strong, passionate supporters. One of the things that Paul mentioned when you're talking to a candidate is how disciplined are they? One of the things, Maddox ran for governor of Texas in 1990 in the Democratic primary. It was Maddox, former governor Mark White, and Treasurer Ann Richards. Ann Richards would go on to win the primary and go on to become governor of Texas in 1990. One of the things that, not Kelly, well maybe it was Kelly, it probably was, but Carville was an advisor in that race. And it's my understanding that Carville would advise Maddox, one of the issues that will work is the lottery and education. And I assume you and Carville,
You're right, it was all Carville. That was all
okay,
Carville.
But it was good advice.
He just run a race in Kentucky on that issue.
And it was work, and it was a good advice. Basically, go out there and say, we need a lottery, and all the money will pay for all our education problems. Very appealing message. Very appealing message. This is a way, non-tax, not raise taxes and do it. Maddox, and he did that. He went out and there was a Hispanic, I think, Loteria C in Puestas, no. Lotteries, yes. Taxes, no. Totally disingenuous campaign, because the lottery would never raise enough money to pay for the education needs that were implied in this, but it was real good politics. The point is this. Kelly and Carville, James Carville, had a candidate who was undisciplined in his own wonderful way. And so as we approached the primary, Maddox would go out and say, lottery and our school children and education, a lottery, school children, education, and that would be fine, until he saw Ann Richards and say, she uses drugs. She asked whether she used cocaine. Very ineffective line. That does not work very well in that primary, where she was seen as being attacked by this bullet about whether she used drugs or not. You get Maddox in the room, lottery, education, lottery, education. He goes out of the room, she's a drug user. So the candidate wasn't disciplined, and I think the effort, I'm probably oversimplifying obviously what happened, but this is business of, are you confident the candidate can be disciplined to stay on message and to really work through your campaign plan?
Well, it's kind of like, I think, Wayne, you may have made this quote on paper, but it's interesting how people who are undisciplined can then offer commentary and critiques of other people, because the best quote of 1990 was Jim Maddox's quote on Clayton Williams, another candidate who maybe lacked some discipline. But he made the statement that Clayton Williams lost the race to Ann Richards in that general election because Clayton Williams shot himself in the foot, reloaded the gun, and shot his other foot. I think that was a great statement, because it came from somebody who had a lot of experience shooting off both his feet.
That was the same election that John Silver, the former dean of liberal arts at UT, who went on to become the president of BU. A very successful president, ran for governor of Massachusetts, and also had an interesting personality. And the line at the end of that campaign was that if Clayton Williams had spent the last month of the Texas campaign in Massachusetts, and John Silver had spent the last Massachusetts campaign in Texas, they both would have become governors of their states. But going back to that line, Kelly, how do you deal you know, when you've got a candidate personality, how do you deal with the strengths and how do you deal with the weaknesses, do you think?
Well, when you have a less than perfect candidate, I've read this, it's never happened to me personally, you can, you need to give voters another reason to vote for that candidate. If you can, sort of slip into the slipstream of another issue that's current and that people care about, so that people are voting for a larger issue than this candidate, who they may recognize as not perfect, but who sort of symbolizes this larger issue. It might be we need to fund our schools better, we need, you know, universal health care, we need to lock up all the felons and throw away the key, some other larger issue than this candidate. That's the way is to surround the candidate with a larger purpose, a more noble cause. You also keep them off TV. I have a couple of candidates currently who
Made for radio.
Yeah, made for radio. You'll never see them on TV, but you will see spots from there's a great congressional candidate here in Austin. He is great in all aspects except he's not Don Howard when the camera's on. He just doesn't come across. And so he's not going to be on TV. So he's a bad candidate in that sense, but in all other sense, he's a pretty good candidate.
Guys, I have a lot of questions I can keep asking, but if anybody that's going to be coming to this course this semester, these guys are the most relevant guys. Here's the campaign plans you're going to be doing. So as I ask my next question, I want you to be thinking about questions so I can stop asking them. So let me ask one more question, and I'd like to hear some questions from you guys in terms of what might be relevant to your campaigns. Have candidates changed over time? Okay, if you take a look at the criticism of sort of the state of democracy in the United States, a lot of folks that are despairing of American politics say that it's becoming more partisan, and they blame it on gerrymandering, breaking up the districts. You only have Republican districts, Democratic districts. The parties are becoming more polarized, and in fact, if you look at the voting records in the United States Congress, the middle, people that actually voted, somewhat with the other side, has disappeared over time. It's actually amazingly dramatic, and that may be partially because the Democratic Party used to be split between an actual conservative southern wing and a liberal northern and western wing. Okay, but that said, are candidates changing over time because they're reflecting more of a partisanship, or are candidates, is there not much of a difference in terms of this sort of deal, in terms of the candidates that you're saying?
I don't really see any difference. I think, the things that keep people from running, I think the number one thing that keeps a really capable person from running is this issue of public scrutiny. I think the second thing that keeps people from running is it's a commitment of time. People who serve in public office make tremendous sacrifices. In fact, I've not seen a single person ever serve in the Texas legislature who's not suffered in some way from the sacrifice that they've made. They either make a sacrifice financially, because serving in the Texas Senate or the Texas House pays $600 a month. You'll spend $500,000 to win an office that pays $600 a month. But or I see them suffer because of their health, or their marriage may suffer, their relationship with their children may suffer, their relationship with their law partners or their business associates may suffer. Something's going to give because it's such a commitment of time. It's not an 8-to-5 job. Being elected to office is 24/7. And I'll have people who are elected to the legislature, and they call me complaining about people calling their house, complaining that their garbage hasn't been picked up. And they'll say, I'm your state rep. I have nothing to do with the collection of your garbage. And they'll say, well, do something about it. It's a city issue. But I think it's a matter of scrutiny, and it's a matter of time. And I think that's a shame, because there's a lot of really capable people who don't run, who could make a difference. But that's not to say that of the people who do run, that you have a lesser quality of people. You still have a good quality pool of people interested in running, but there is a tremendous sacrifice that's made, and I haven't seen that change. And you can think of things that could make it easier for people to serve. In the age of internet, you could have people being able to cast their votes from their district offices on issues on the floor of the House or the Senate in Washington, D.C., so they could spend more time back home. Because literally, it's all staged in Washington anyway. There's no real spontaneous debate that ever goes on. And why don't we use technology to allow these members of Congress to be more available to their districts and more available to their families? Because if you serve in Congress, you literally you work 3 to 4 days in Washington, and then you fly back to your district every week. And then additionally, you're expected to be at events and fundraisers and all these other things, and it is a real grind.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think that the quality of candidates is necessary, with a couple of prominent exceptions, degraded. But what Brian's point, I mean, we're talking a lot about the Texas legislature, and Brian's point is well taken. You know, we have an unreasonable expectation. We are electing year-round, full-time lawmakers, but treating them as though they were still only serving 140 days every 2 years, and paying them that way, so that they have to, you know, have other lives, other jobs. And it's just an unreasonable, we've set them up to fail in that regard.
I think we make it harder right now. When the average cost of a state representative campaign could be as high as $300,000 to $500,000. Sometimes it takes it beyond the means of people who make less than $100,000 a year. So I think it's somewhat disappointing when you see fewer and fewer public school teachers or retired teachers have a chance to run, or law enforcement officials, or just people with just normal jobs. And then you tend to see more and more people running who are very successful financially because they can afford to run. And that's one thing that I really wish could be changed in state government, that it could be somehow reshuffled so that we have more of an opportunity for kind of more ordinary people to have a chance to run, where they don't have to be retired or overly wealthy to be able to run for the legislature, or have one spouse or the other spouse make such a large income that they can afford to do that.
Okay, folks, you're going to be running state campaigns. We got a question back over there.
Yeah, from a practical standpoint, where would you begin, if, other than what the candidate gives you up front, when it comes to doing both opposition research for your opposition and for the candidate themselves? I mean, is it as simple as starting with LexisNexis, or?
Sure, you can do that.
Okay.
Public record search, you'll come up with all the arrest, you know, you'll come up with my 8 DWIs. And I think it's only 7, but.
I think, you know, what we typically do is we start with basics. We look at every public record that's obtainable. And so you look at personal public records, you look at business public records, you look at tax records. You just run through the gamut of looking at public documents. And then you run through a veracity check. You know, there was a lady who was probably the most promising up-and-coming Hispanic politician in the history of Texas, modern time, who went out and was appointed by Ann Richards to the Texas Railroad Commission, who had served in the Texas House of Representatives. And one of her biggest attributes was that she had graduated from the University of Texas, but not just graduated, she was Phi Beta Kappa. And it's so vivid in my mind because there was one year where I traveled the state and did 15 different campaign management workshops with a group of other consultants and press people and politicians. And this person, Lena Guerrera, was one of the speakers. And I typically would either have to warm her up or I'd get to follow her, which was a real bummer because she was such a dynamic speaker. But she was always introduced as Lena Guerrera, a bright star on the Texas horizon, graduate of the University of Texas, and a Phi Beta Kappa. The only problem was she did not graduate from the University of Texas, ergo she was not Phi Beta Kappa. But it was never, no one ever checked that out on her resume. Somewhere along the way in her political career, the statement that she attended the University of Texas had gotten stretched in that she had graduated from the University of Texas. And then somewhere along the way, because she was so sharp, someone said, well, maybe she was Phi Beta Kappa, and somehow that got stuck on her resume, and she never took the time to correct it. And so finally, when she's running in
92.
Carl Rove was the consultant for the opposition, and Carl actually did a veracity check. In other words, you take the things that are being said about your candidate and your opponent, and you just make sure they're accurate. And sure enough, they find that she did not graduate from the University of Texas, so they exposed it. And Lena's comment was, it was a small lie, like a snowball at the top of a mountain. It had rolled down the hill and got bigger and bigger and bigger, and she just didn't know how to correct it until finally the truth came out. So one of the things we do is make sure that when a candidate brings us an 8-page resume, there's somebody in my office that will actually check everything out and make sure that everything on there is true. But you look for phrases. Talk about college graduates. We elect a lot of people to the legislature who do not have college degrees. I've elected many people who don't have high school degrees. The highest, I guess, the minimum level of education of anyone that we've elected, and it was a mayor's position, not a legislative position, was the guy who had a 6th grade education. He ended up being the mayor of the 5th largest city in Texas. But when you see a phrase like, it says, Kelly attended MIT, I know immediately when he says attended that he didn't graduate from MIT. And so you look for key phrases that people will use, but if he says he graduated, I'm not going to believe him. I'm actually going to go look it up and make sure that he really did graduate. And also, people may write, if they're lawyers, they may write articles in their law review, on all kinds of topics. And sometimes, you have very prolific lawyers, but they may have taken some really weird arguments. So we love to go back and read college papers and law review articles, because you'd be surprised the kind of stuff you find in those documents.
This is the Robert Bork analysis. Question way in the back.
Y'all get to really know these candidates over the course of working for them and watching them do their thing once they get elected, if they get elected. The ones that have a problem, that are corrupt, that are using their position to gain money or to do something else. In your experience, does that happen because of the power that they've gained, or is that more of their character? And you kind of had a hunch about that when you first met them, when you first got to know them?
I think it's a character flaw. I mean, you see that from college professors that maybe cross the line with grants, or politicians that get in office, or people that run corporations, like the former CEO of Radio Shack, who falsified his college credentials. And they hire this guy, and like a year into being CEO, someone figures out he didn't really have all the degrees that he said he had. I don't think people become corrupted by the office. I think they become dehumanized sometimes by the office, because it's not a reality. When you're holding office and everyone's trying to hand you a contribution, and when everyone refers to you by a title, I don't think I've ever had any client ever served that didn't have that affect them somehow. And it's always curious. We always kind of see how long is it going to take this candidate or that candidate to let that title get to them. But even your most humble people, what I see is more affecting them is not the corruption of character, it's just the sense of value of everyone referring to you as your honor, or congressman, or senator, or what have you.
Tonight if you're a Jon Stewart fan, tonight he will interview the president of Bolivia, Evo Morales. And Evo I've worked on his campaign, and he is literally, he is the caricature of the Indian who has risen to run his country. He really is that. And yet I have seen over the last year, people around him call him Señor Presidente. And he was just Evo. He was Evito to most people. So even a guy like that who was just completely grounded and could never have his head turned, has had his head turned a little bit.
It's really, a measure of a politician's sense of humbleness, I think, can be seen as to whether the people around them refer to them as senator, or whether the people around them are allowed the ability to refer to them by their first name. And it's kind of grounding to see politicians that still insist that their staff refer to them by their first name, that not not give them this glorified accolade that they're a better person, because they're not. They're just like everybody else. They just have a position of elected responsibility.
I was walking around Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge, Massachusetts once, and, a very beautiful old cemetery, and I saw 3 separate graves that had a name and somebody, and among other things, they said Lieutenant Governor of some state. And this is a really bizarre thought, but in terms of opposition research, but I always thought, if I passed away and I was buried there and I said I'd been Lieutenant Governor of the state of Kentucky, it was one of those things that nobody ever checked, because why would anybody ever check who the Lieutenant Governor was? So that wouldn't do very much for me at the end, anyway. The question over here.
Is Texas still a red state, or will Democrats be able to compete for statewide jobs next year?
It is a changing state. It is not. It's like the country's changing, in my opinion. Bryan and I have debated this, and I won't speak for him. I suspect he might not completely agree with me, but I think there's a partisan transformation taking place that is perhaps a little less so in Texas because we're so red, but it's happening here as well. I think in some states, I don't know if Texas is one or not, we are moving into what I call the post-partisan era in some areas where people are so disgusted and frustrated and fed up with the two-party system that it's not necessarily that it's moving from Republican to Democrat as it is moving away from the two-party system. I'm not suggesting that suddenly the Greens or Libertarians are going to be, I think, the next president. We're lifetimes away from that. But, not in my lifetime, and probably not in your lifetime, but I do think we are in a transitional period in which we are sort of looking for other identifiers for our candidates than their party affiliation. Even in Texas a little bit. I do think there are a couple of viable statewide Democratic campaigns in Texas for 2008, and likely to, if the trends continue, likely to be more in 2010.
Yeah, I would offer a different viewpoint, and that's the viewpoint that nationally, going back to 2004, even though George W. Bush was reelected president, the number of Republicans that held local offices across the United States went down. Democrats gained offices in 2004, even though George W. Bush beat John Kerry. And that was as much a referendum. It shifted from being a referendum on Bush late in that campaign to being a referendum on swift boat veterans and John Kerry. But yet the Democratic Party was making major inroads across the United States, not so much in Texas, but across the country. And then in 2006, that march continued, and Democrats continued to gain not only additional offices, but they gained majorities of state legislatures, they gained governor's offices. It was a across-the-map sweep everywhere but here in Texas. And here in Texas, what do we have going on? We have a changing demographic that's not voting. And that's why we're not seeing really, I think, a change in the redness or the blueness of the state. But every statewide office in 2004 that was Republican. Every statewide office, we survived through the 2004 election, Republicans, and the 2006, and they're still all Republican, and none of them were really even close this last election, even with the governor receiving only 39% of the vote. Of course, that was offset by Kay Bailey Hutchison receiving 63% or more of the vote. So the state has stayed Republican with its statewide officials. In the Texas State Senate, the Senate is more Republican today than it was 4 or 5 years ago. There's 31 seats in the Senate, and that's actually a gain of just 1 seat for Republican. That's because a Democrat Senator, Ken Armbruster, retired, and the Republicans finally won a seat. But where there have been gains by the Democratic Party is in the office that I think, the state office that's closest to the people, and that's in the Texas House of Representatives. After redistricting in 2002, the Republicans went into the legislature with 88 seats, and it only takes 75 to have a majority. They had 88, and the Democrats had 62 in the Texas House of Representatives. Well, From 2003 to present, Republicans have lost 10 districts. There are 10 districts that were represented by Republicans in 2003 that are now represented by Democrats. During that same period of time, the Republicans have defeated 2 Democratic incumbents. And that's why there's a net differential right now of 8. There are 80 Republicans and 70 Democrats. And there's an open seat right now that will probably stay Republican. But so the Republicans have been losing ground in the Texas House of Representatives. And so I think if there's going to be change from a redness to a blueness, we're seeing that change. It's happening in a major way in the Texas House of Representatives right now. But that's not uncommon. Back when the Democrats had control of the legislature, they would do redistricting where they would be really greedy and draw all these districts to elect the most Democrats on the front end of a decade.
But it's a very close edge.
It's a close edge, and by the time the state would grow towards the end of the decade, you would always see partisanship would melt away from the party in power. And we're seeing the same thing right now. Republicans drew a very aggressive map in 2002, but they haven't been able to hold on to their gains. It's just been melting away. They haven't been able to hold on to their gains in the congressional map. The congressional map is more Democratic in Texas, but part of that's because of some scandals, not so much because of voting trends. But this anomaly that we have of running a good campaign and appealing to the masses, and that will get you elected, having the right messaging and the right discipline. I kind of look at it more statistically, more objectively and less subjectively. And that is, of all the people that are eligible to vote, roughly half are registered to vote. Of all the people that are registered to vote, only half of those people are going to vote in a big election, presidential election. Of all the people who vote, you only need half of that to win. So that's 12.5%. If you looked at the last governor's race where you had only a third of the voters voting, the winning campaign would have been one that went out and got 7% of the potential electorate to vote for them, 7%. And in reality, we had someone win with only like around 5%. So 5% of the potential voters of the state of Texas elected the person who's currently governor. That type of voter apathy is something that I hope will change. And the legislature has been trying to address voter apathy, but the more it's tried to address it, the more apathetic we have become. So one of the things is, Kelly or I may have a candidate that may not be popular to this side of the room, but he or she might be popular to this side of the room. And so if we know which 7 people on this side of the room are important for us to win a race, we may ignore this side of the room, focus on just these 7 people, because we know we can rifle shot exactly who we need to go to win a race. So unfortunately, politics has become, with the internet and with blogging and with the overexposure to news, and that's the one thing I see in campaigns, there's more access to people through the internet. And the question, I think, from the back of the room a while ago about us meeting candidates, we've elected 5 candidates to the Texas legislature who I never met until they were sworn into office. We did their entire campaigns over the internet. And I knew what they looked like. They never knew what I looked like, so they didn't know it when I was standing beside them at the Capitol. But this issue of more access and more exposure to the news, instead of allowing the public to be empowered by access and by the internet, people have become more lethargic. And that's a real shame, because people like Kelly and I, we don't want to waste our money with y'all if we can't win your vote, or we don't need your vote. We're just going to spend our money efficiently on where we need to go to win a race. And so as more and more the public becomes more and more apathetic, campaigns become more and more adept at targeting. And so it's kind of like a vicious cycle. Fewer people are voting, campaigns are narrowing their scope of outreach. Before long, we're going to have 20% of the voters voting, electing the next president of the United States. But even in the last presidential election, you had only 50% of the voters nationwide turn out to vote. That's pretty incredible. I did an election in Wyoming a few years ago, and we did 2 referendums. We lost one and won one. But one of the things that caught us off guard in Wyoming was their voter turnout was 108%. That's because they have same-day voter registration in Wyoming. In Texas, you have to be registered to vote 30 days before an election before you can vote. And then to make things even more onerous, the legislature almost passed a bill last session that would require photo ID to vote, which is a very popular issue in the public. The public wants people to have to whip out a photograph to prove that they are the person on their, who they say they are on their voter registration card before they can vote. And I think that will pass sometime in the near future.
Well, it's in front of the Supreme Court right now. There's a legal case that's, I believe the Indiana law is in front of the Supreme Court right now. The Supreme Court is deciding if they're going to take up the case or not.
Yeah.
And Georgia just, the federal court just reversed themselves and let the ID law go into effect. Obviously, this is highly partisan. There's actually a very nice piece in the New York Times today, for those of you that have access to the New York Times website on this specific issue. If you want to take a look, it's sort of like a thumbnail of the legal arguments on it.
Last year in Dallas, they had 1 million people march on City Hall, legal and illegal immigrants
Right.
protesting legal immigration reform. And the streets were flooded, just like an ocean of people. And they said, we're going to ask everyone that's here today to come back 2 weeks from today, and we're going to do a big voter registration campaign. And so all the TV stations, Dallas Morning News showed up. They had a little canopy tent set up in front of Dallas City Hall, and nobody was there. Nobody. I think they registered 10 people.
I think one of the interesting things as we close up over here to look at, and partially one of the reasons why we had the conference on Friday on the future of Hispanic politics, is that I think one of the things that a lot of political analysts, and I'm assuming also people that run campaigns, are curious about, is the sleeping giant of the Hispanic electorate in Texas. Wayne and his compatriots write about this every single election. It's just the year that people are going to turn out. This was the whole deal with the Tony Sanchez, strategy in 2002, which quite obviously didn't work so well. But, at some point, these folks will vote more and more as people become citizens, as they're here longer, especially as people rise up socioeconomic level and age cohorts get older, people tend to vote more. And the thing that people are looking at right now, and Mike Vasquez will be in here, I think in 3 or 4 weeks on research, was talking about on Friday, is what percentages are we talking about? Are we talking about a 60-40 split, Democrat and Republican, a 70-30 split, an 80-20 split? And what's the impact of the rhetoric? Not so much the actual policies in the immigration debate, but the rhetoric. And one of the things that I look at in something like this is, and you guys, and I know Kelly knows, and Bryan, you've probably heard people like Lionel Sosa, the dean of Republican media guys, Hispanic media guys in San Antonio, coming out and endorsing Bill Richardson for president. Is this a tip of an iceberg? Is it an anomaly? No one knows, but these are the sorts of things that you look at in terms of dynamics in this. We got to stop over here, come over here and ask these guys more questions. And remember, we're going to be getting into the group reports today. I want to hear back from your TAs soon as we get you guys in those campaigns. Thank you very much.
Thank you.